Jiang City Public Security, an interrogation room. A green light illuminated the small room. A lamp burning from above illuminated the table that stood in the small room. There was someone sitting at the table, and on his desk were various papers. He grabbed his head. His face was distorted with madness, sweat was running down his face and his teeth were clenched. His eyes were filled with blood. Jiang City Public Security, first-rank police officer Zhu Jing. The door opened and a uniformed girl stood in the passage. Her hair was pulled back and she wore glasses on her face. She clutched files to her chest and addressed Mr. Zhang Ai with a serious face. Behind her, a red mist was spreading. His eyes only became crazier as the image of the woman was displayed in his eyes. He abruptly jumped off the chair and started yelling for her to close the door as soon as possible. Zhang Ai continued to cover his face and turned away from side to side. The girl walked inside and said that she would close the door, only he needed to calm down. The red mist stretched towards the open door. The girl walked inside and closed the door behind her, walking closer to the table. Zhang Ai continued to sit leaning over the table with his hands buried in his hair. The girl stepped closer and asked if Zhang Ai could now tell her exactly what had happened. Zhang Ai blanched slightly and replied that he had already mentioned that she definitely wouldn't believe him. The girl's face contorted and she shouted for him not to dare play the fool because he wouldn't escape criminal responsibility anyway. She swung and the phone landed on the table with a clatter. The phone's screen revealed a picture of two girls lying on the floor with their arms around each other. The woman cried out and loudly told him to think about what he had even done to his family. Zhang Ai looked at the phone screen and then his face contorted again in horror as he looked behind the woman's back with frantic eyes. Zhang Ai started shaking madly and pointing behind her back, talking about what was behind her. The girl didn't realize what had happened and turned around abruptly, looking at the door behind her. The door was illuminated with a red glow. The girl replied loudly that there was nothing there. She turned around and saw Zhang Ai crawling under the table. The man was trembling and continued to hold his head as she loudly said about how he better not even dare to be sneaky. Zhang Ai continued to shiver and talk about not. Cracks started to run across the floor. Many eyes showed through the cracks in the floor. Zhang Ai continued to shiver as the girl walked around the table and came closer. She crouched under the table and called out to Zhang Ai as her face contorted ugly. A multitude of eyes formed on her face. Her mouth turned into a toothy mouth with another huge eye sticking out of it. Zhang Ai's face contorted, and in the next second, he screamed loudly and knocked over the table. He started yelling for her to back off and not dare to approach him. In the next second, a fist flew into Zhang Ai's mouth. It was his own hand that he put in his mouth. His eyes rolled back and the blurry image of a woman started screaming for him to take his hand away and what he was even doing. It was sunset outside. A tall building towered under the night sky. Several beautiful girls were posing, one sitting in the center of the room and the other two on either side of her. A voice asked what happened next. It was Jiang City High School, the Ghost Society's game room. 3 people were sitting at computers, and there were cushions with anime images of drawn girls scattered around the room. The second voice said that after the police came running he had already killed himself, and they said he had bitten off his tongue. It was Zai Bin. He was grimacing as he grabbed his throat and began to mimic strangulation. The second boy was cradling a toy and talking about how he definitely wouldn't be able to sleep all night after this scarecrow. It was Lai Zhongxing. Zai Bin leaned on the back of the chair and threw his hands behind his head, saying that this was not a scary story and that it was a real story from a public security organization. The news had already spread all over the internet. Zai Bin made an intimidating face and said with his eyes wide open that as far as he knew, it was all because of one photo on the internet, and whoever saw that photo would die. Lai Zhongxing immediately trembled in horror, his face turning pale as he clenched his teeth and asked what photo he was talking about. Zai Bin took out his phone and said he would look for it now as he started typing something on the screen. Lai Zhongxing immediately turned pale, his eyes wide open. He started yelling for him to stop, and if what he said was true, then they definitely shouldn't be looking at this photo. Lai Zhongxing abruptly snatched the phone from his friend, jumping up from his seat and started shouting unhappily in his face. The third young man, who had previously sat quietly and did not get involved in the conversation, typed something on the keyboard and asked if this was what they were talking about. Lai Zhongxing and Zai Bin immediately turned around at his voice. Lai Zhongxing with a worried and frightened face, and Zai Bin with more of a face of interest in what was being talked about. On the computer screen, a forum was open and on it was a post with a photo. This photo showed a huge red eye surrounded by a dark red substance. Lai Zhongxing and Zai Bin immediately cried out in horror. The third young man, whose name was Yuan Zhen, told them not to worry so much and everything would be fine. He was slightly older than them, had dark short hair and red eyes. The two boys meanwhile trembled in terror. Huddled together as a trembling Lai Zhongxing asked why he was even so sure about this. Yunjin said calmly that if everyone died just by looking at the photo, the world would have ended long ago, and as for those dead people, the matter there was that there was a demon sitting in their souls. Yunjin started to rise from his seat, slightly bowed his head and said that so be it, let them continue playing onward as he had some other things to do. The boys immediately indignantly told him not to let Yunjin spoil everyone's mood and asked him what time it was and that he was acting like an old man. The boys turned around at Yunjin's departing figure and asked why he was leaving so early, since he was definitely not going to study anyway. Yunjin turned his back to them and raised his hand up, bidding them farewell and saying that some other time. Yunjin's house. It was already dark outside. Thick clouds had thickened over the tall multi-story buildings. Lanterns and signs illuminated the dark street. Yunjin walked to the door and slipped the key into the keyhole, turning this. He opened the front door with his head slightly lowered. His name was Yunjin. He was an ordinary university student, living the most ordinary life. Yunjin walked inside the room. The lights inside were not lit, and only the light of the corridor slightly illuminated the path in front of the guy. He was an ordinary student until a month ago when he heard some strange voices in the library. Yunjin stood on the stepladder, reaching out to the books on the shelf. A red mist began to envelop the library, and Yunjin opened his eyes in surprise. He saw a book that was burning with red light. It had an unusual cover, and Yunjin slowly pulled the book from the shelf. He opened the book and something burst out upwards towards the ceiling. He was curious, and he opened the book titled Urban Legends. The book had a dark cover, there were various patterns all over it, and a red crystal was burning at the top in the center. Yunjin opened his eyes in surprise when he saw the red crystal in front of his face, which was sparkling with a bright light. After that, Yunjin found himself in this world and became a student of Jiang City High School. Yunjin was sitting in the middle of the street, leaning towards the ground. Rain was dripping down from above him, and a book was lying beside him. Yunjin frowned slightly as the rain continued to pour down on him from above. His parents had died in a plane crash, leaving him with an inheritance and insurance compensation, thus sparing him from any worries. Yunjin remembered standing in front of the grave. There were two pictures of a man and a woman on the stone, a bouquet of flowers on the stone while the dark sky was shrouded in clouds and the rain continued to pour down without ceasing. Yunjin stood in front of the grave, hunched over. Despite everything, but because of this book, he only had 30 days to live. Yunjin shifted his gaze to the book, which opened up and the leaves started to turn over by themselves. He looked at the page of the book that had the following information written on it. Legend points, 0. Good and evil points, 0. Remaining life 30 days. Yunjin touched the crystal that was hanging around his neck. Yunjin put his hands out in front of him as a dark book began to unfold in front of him, enveloping everything in black and red light. He held the book in his hands. Yunjin unfolded it, and on the pages was written information. City legend records, legend points, 38,000, good and evil points, 200, spiritual power, 0+, remaining life, 92 days, 1. All the legends you have recorded will come true, 2. The legends you record will benefit you, you will receive a certain number of legend points, 3. If someone dies because of the legends you have recorded, you will receive good and evil points. According to the rules of the book, he should record urban legends and get good and evil points, this way he could prolong his life. Yunjin continued to flip through the book he was holding. He examined the book and noticed that once he wrote down a legend, it would immediately come to life. And the first legend he wrote down was about a daughter and a mother who lived in the neighborhood and who were killed in a violent way. On the page of the book was written, Urban Legend, A Glimpse Through the Gap. On March 4, 2020, one photo appeared on the websites of Jiang City. This photo was very strange, it showed a huge eye. As soon as someone saw this photo in Jiang City, domestic violence would appear in that person's family, and eyes would look at the killer from all the cracks. The photo showed a huge red eye surrounded by dark meat. The eye could stare at a person from any crevice, altering the person's consciousness, driving them to the point of losing their mind and eventually committing suicide. The next page of the book read, June 7, 2020, Zhang Ai was returning home intoxicated. Since the bath water was not hot enough at home, he started beating his wife. There was another very strange circumstance. The experience of whoever was looking at the photo and who was then followed by the eye was recorded in text on the pages of this book. Zhang Ai would stand on top of his wife and daughter, who were huddled together, and swing at them. Afterward, he held up his phone and looked at the screen, which showed an eye. Good and evil points +2, legend points +370. 1 page per person, 2 good and evil points for each person, and depending on the degree of influence of the legend, 300 minus 400 legend points. Yunjin slammed the book shut. He sat down at the table and looked at the book in his hands, thinking that he had gotten too little from this story, and that it had already been a month and he was able to increase his life expectancy from 30 days to 92 days. He put his hand to his forehead and sighed as he held the book in his hands and looked at it. He needed a new story that could make up for this, otherwise this number would reach 0 someday. Yoon-jin squinted his eyes slightly, sweat running down his face. He was afraid. The image of an open book from which dark rays of light were stretching out clenched around his throat. Yoon-jin was afraid that he would really die. Jeong City High School, Class K. There were a few students in the classroom, but many desks were still empty. A few classmates were chatting with each other and one of the girls said that he was extremely fond of eating and had been sleeping all day. Another girl approached the young man's desk and told Yoon-jin that classes were already over and he should have woken up. The other classmate slung her briefcase on her shoulder and said with a smile on her face that they should go to the community. Yoon-jin slowly opened his eyes. He got up from his desk and slowly stretched, yawning and stretching in his chair. He stood up and rubbed his neck, thinking about how extremely tired he was, having made up a new story until 4 a.m. yesterday. Yoon-jin continued to rub his neck and complained that it hurt. Yoon-jin walked out of the classroom and continued walking down the street just as slightly puzzled, rubbing his neck and head and thinking about how it was useless to look for inspiration in the ghost society, and they are only there idling or playing computer games. Yoon-jin started to slowly walk down the stairs. The sun had already started to slowly set. He took out his phone from his pocket and started to look at the screen, thinking about sending a message that he wouldn't come today. Yoon-jin looked at the screen of the phone, which had Ghost Society open and his message on it, in which he apologized and said about not sleeping all night today and so he'd better go home. This was immediately followed by messages from the guys, in which Lee Jong-sing was outraged and wrote that he had tricked them again. And Sai-bin wrote that maybe Yoon-jin was actually playing games at home hidden from them to impress them all later. Following that, he sent some disgruntled messages. Yoon-jin read the messages and laughed awkwardly. They were joking around, and he had a matter of life and death here. Suddenly, Yoon-jin's attention was caught by a voice nearby. He was passing by and saw a crowd of people in a nook. One of the voices was telling the other that he had asked for it. One of the boys was holding the other by the collar of his sweater. The other boy was wearing glasses and was backing away from the one who was swinging his fist at him and about to hit him. Behind them stood a few other high school kids who were watching everything with smirks on their faces. The bully kept swinging at him and telling him that he had snitched on the teacher because of some 50 yuan, and did he really have enough to live for? The beaten boy lay on the ground and tried to cover himself with his hands. His glasses were broken and blood was streaming from his nose. He was trembling and begging for forgiveness, trying to stop him and asking him to stop. Yoon-jin interrupted them and asked, was 5 against 1 fair, and they weren't ashamed at all. The bully looked back at the stranger's voice as the beaten young man continued to shake. He turned around, holding the bat in his other hand, and asked grudgingly who he even was and did he really want to die so badly. The other guys also looked back at him and one of them recognized Yoon-jin. Yoon-jin stood in front of them, frowned and asked if they really knew who he was. One of the guys immediately became nervous and tried to stop the bully, saying that they should leave and that Yoon-jin was the real psycho. The other guy indignantly asked about how they would really be afraid of him alone. The one who recognized Yoon-jin smiled nervously and talked about how last semester the 5 of them had dealt with him and 3 ended up in the hospital, one of them still not going to school. The bully stammered a little. His face turned pale, and the other guys were also silent for a while. Yoon-jin continued to stare at them silently, frowning slightly, his face pale and threatening. Eventually, the bully threw the bat on the ground, and they all turned around in the opposite direction of Yoon-jin. The bully put his hands in his pants pockets and said that he was hungry, so they better go and eat already. The rest of the boys immediately hurried after him, passing by the beaten young boy. The boy fixed his broken glasses, his face battered. He hesitantly stammered and thanked Yoon-jin for helping him. This boy was Kim Zae-oshin. Yoon-jin answered nothing and turned around, intending to leave while Kim Zae-oshin bowed in gratitude and thanked him for his help, standing in the same spot. Yoon-jin returned home, mentally thanking him for being able to give him inspiration. Yoon-jin sat at his desk, the room lit up by the light of the monitor in front of his face. Yoon-jin was rapidly typing something on the screen with his fingers. On the open tab of the website, it said, Search 3W. 66com, School bullying is a tumor on the body of society, say no to bullying in school. Just below it was information accompanied by graphic images. The father of Jeong City Schools Research published a report that said that recently there has been an increase in bullying in schools. Even some of the best schools in the city cannot solve the problem. It is also reported that the anti-bullying measures taken in schools are not helping. The study was based on the results of a survey of 38,540 students and 46 schools. The study found that 46% of junior high school students and 73% of high school students have ever experienced bullying at school. Youth development research data showed that more than 80% of middle school students have ever used violence. According to the statistics, more than 2,000 incidents of school violence have been publicized in the media this year. Research by the Youth Development Center last year showed that 58.9% of middle school students have ever or continuously experienced violence. Jen read the entire article in front of his eyes and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. No matter the world, bullying existed everywhere. Jen touched the crystal that was hanging on his chest. He remembered the shivering and beaten boy who was lying on the ground and trying to defend himself. Bullies most often hurt those who don't have the strength to respond or those who don't have support. Jen took the book in his hands and opened it. If he gave weapons to those who suffer from bullying, he would be able to dig out the deeply planted seed of violence. Jen put the book down on the table and picked up a pen, starting to write something on a piece of paper. A notification popped up that the legend points were 30,000. Jen wrote down a legend. Every night at 0 a.m., the names of people who are seized by evil appear on a website called Realm of the Dead, and a soul from the afterlife can be seen there. Her name was Minai. The girl's eyes flashed a dark red color and her long hair was developing. Her voice was indignant, saying that she had told him not to dare to come to the school, so why was he here again? The camera was pointed at the man who had been punched in the face. The girls continued to laugh angrily and record what was happening on camera, when one of them shouted loudly that the girl was so ugly, so why was she bothering the others? Because if it were her, she would have died a long time ago. The beaten girl was lying on the ground, shrunken into a ball. Her belongings were scattered on the floor as the other girls surrounded her and filmed the whole thing on their phones, still laughing. One of them leaned over and squatted down, continuing to smile and talk about why she was even coming since she was so disgusting. The beaten girl clutched her eyes tightly and tears streamed down her cheeks, various signs painted on her face. She continued to cry and shake, sitting on her knees, when one of the voices said that they should take a picture of this ugly girl as soon as possible, and that if she met her on the street, she would definitely think that she had accidentally stumbled upon a ghost. One of the people who bullied the girl was Shihaiyue. The girl with long blonde hair was laughing and mocking her. She kept talking about how horrible she was. The girl who was being laughed at was Gulia. With trembling hands, she moved her briefcase towards her and slowly took out a red burning flower. One of the mockers said that she was getting so ridiculously angry, so she was also fighting back. Shihaiyue came closer and grabbed Gulia by the hair, and the girl grinned evilly as tears continued to run down her face. She held the flower tightly in her hands, cradling it in her hands. Gulia clenched her teeth and said that she had forced her to do it herself. The girl with blonde hair grabbed her hair even more roughly, saying what she was doing and that she was better off dead. She kept laughing and talking about how it was even funny that she thought about being able to kill her with some simple red flower. Gulia tore a petal off the flower and frowned slightly, looking at the girl in front of her. His hand trembled. In the next instant, the face of the blonde who was mocking her distorted into an incomprehensible grimace. Her eyes were replaced by two black holes, her face turned gray and wrinkled, and her mouth was open. She turned sharply toward the girls who were bullying with her. The girls immediately screamed in horror that there was a ghost in front of them. Shihaiyue rushed towards them, telling them to help her. The girls rushed towards the exit with loud screams as the trembling possessed girl walked towards them. Her neck crunched as she slumped to the ground the next second. The phone left on the ground continued to record everything that was happening. Gulia stood behind the fallen body and trembled, looking at the figure in front of her in horror. In the next moment, a voice asked Gulia if she was the girl in the video. She sat up, clutching her briefcase and trembling. Her jaws were tightly clenched and tears rolled from her eyes as she continued to shiver. The girl replied in a trembling voice that yes, it was her. It was the principal's office, the old school of Jiang City. A girl with long blonde hair sat across from a young girl who was trembling with her head down. Another young girl with short red hair was standing next to her. The girl with red hair said, holding up the documents, said that as of 9 a.m. today, the number of abnormal deaths in the city had exceeded 200. This was Kai Zioyan, the assistant. She held her phone in her hands and frowned slightly as she read the information. She added that they were the same as Shihaiyue. All of them were brain dead, but no indicators of violent death were found. Gulia continued to shiver, lowering her head as tears continued to form in her eyes. The girl's voice told her that she was the only suspect detained by the special division. The woman in the chair frowned slightly and asked if she had communicated with the girl from the afterlife and for her to elaborate. Kai Zioyan said with a serious frown that it was the head of the special department, King Jai, the only one who was capable of helping her at the moment. She also added that she hoped that she would not do rash things. The woman's code name was King Jai, Special Department. King Jai sat with a serious expression on her face, frowning slightly. She sat legged up, crossing her hands in her lap. Gulia bowed her head slightly and said so and so. She began to talk about how a few days ago, a strange post appeared on the R forum at midnight that could not be deleted or edited. The post contained information about an urban legend, a girl from the afterlife. Several tabs were open with screaming captions, "The girl from the afterlife exists." Hell chat, which is only available at night. If you fill in the name of the person you hold a grudge against in the chat room, the girl from the underworld will appear and plunge that person into the abyss of hell. At first everyone thought it was an announcement of some game, no one believed it was real. The tab with Forum R was open, and several messages from different people were posted there. Melon Lover, Girl from the Afterlife, a new urban legend, Horse Monkey, could this be a new game? Is this how they're trying to promote it? Giant, tried going to the site, it opens a chat room, but you can't write there yet. I want to become rich, but I don't want to work, I can't go there, although it's not midnight yet. Desperate, I want to try to go there in the evening, maybe I'll find something interesting. Gulia continued and added that she waited until midnight, then clicked on the link and everything opened. The girl sat in a dark room at her computer, the red screen light illuminated the room. On the red screen, "How can I help you?" popped up and a line at the bottom with the answer written on it. Gulia wrote the name Shihihui. She pressed her feet together and frowned, biting her lower lip nervously. She said that she knew she shouldn't have done this kind of thing, and she realized that if the legends didn't lie, the person might die. Gulia hesitantly reached out a trembling hand to the keyboard before sending. Gulia remembered standing in front of the teacher's desk. Slop dripped off of her and tears rolled from her eyes as she tried to talk to the teacher. However, the woman interrupted her and asked her why they were targeting her specifically, and maybe she should have thought about her behavior then. The next moment she remembered her irritated and angry mother taking a swing at her, striking out at her and yelling that how could she even think about transferring, and didn't she know how much effort she had to put in to get accepted into this very school. In another moment, she remembered how the girls bullied her by pouring slop on her. Gulia's face contorted with anger and resentment. She was fed up with it, and if the girl from the afterlife existed, then she would accept her help. After these thoughts, the girl pressed the send button. A notification popped up that the message had been sent. 1, 2, 3 seconds passed. Gulia began to cry, clenching her jaws and thinking about how stupid it was of her to rely on an urban legend. The next moment, the girl felt her head start to spin. She heard someone's voice asking if she was the one she was looking for. Gulia opened her eyes in surprise when she saw the girl in front of her with her arms crossed behind her back. They were in the middle of a field of flowers. Gulia hesitantly asked if she was the girl from the afterlife, covering her eyes from the bright light. The girl from the afterlife, Yuminai, confirmed and said that it was her. Her eyes were shining a bright red color, and in her hand was a red flower. Gulia slightly recoiled, and the girl immediately told her not to be afraid. After all, she had come here to help her. Yuminai slowly approached her. She bowed down in front of her and held out the flower she held in her hands before, telling her to take it. She added that once the girl plucked the flower, then she would make a contract. Gulia stretched out her trembling hand towards the outstretched flower. The girl from the afterlife said that the person she held a grudge against would be exiled to hell. Gulia took the flower in her hands and remained silent, frowning. Yuminai added that after that, her own soul would also go there. Gulia's eyes widened in horror when she heard those words. Yuminai's eyes flashed with a bright red light as she explained that cursing others would affect her karma, and her soul would no longer be able to enter heaven after such a thing, and would live in agony in hell. The girl was behind her back and leaned towards her, telling her that the choice was hers to make anyway. Gulia pressed her lips together and looked at the flower in her hands. Gulia continued to tell, while tears streamed down her face, that by the time she came to her senses, she was already sitting in the bedroom. One of the girls asked her if she knew what happened afterward. The woman opened her eyes, they shone with a bright blue light. She shifted her gaze to Gulia and saw a black substance burning inside her chest. It was a curse, the price for killing. The woman stood up and moved closer, asking her if she had interacted with anyone else in these past 2 days, and if anything unusual had happened during that time. Gulia replied that no. The woman stretched out her hand in front of her, the device on it lit up with a bright blue light. She frowned and thought to herself that it was like the curse was only reflected on the people who contracted it. Kai Zioan's spiritual power level was too low and she wouldn't be able to discern the curse, so only she was capable of doing so. Turquoise fire enveloped the woman around her, her hand glowing with a bright light. On the back of her palm, a symbol was depicted. Kai Zioan stared at her in horror, her lips tightening and her eyes wide open. She thought to herself, did Madame King Jai really manage to detect something? After all, she is using a thief's hand. It was said that this hand had the ability to steal everything, whether it was physical or conceptual. King Jai extended her hand towards the girl, and a bright turquoise color enveloped the room. She ordered her not to move and added that she was lifting the curse. Gulia clenched her eyes and jaws tightly, enveloped in fire. Kai Zioan frowned and thought to herself that the price was that by using this technique, you yourself would be left without something, and it wouldn't be clothes or other consumables, but any organs, be it liver, heart and other. A bright glowing ball of light formed between Gulia and King Jai as she continued to hold the hand extended towards her. King Jai frowned as Gulia clenched her eyes tightly and sweat dripped from her face. The curse in her chest was starting to slowly dissolve. However, in the next second, Gulia screamed loudly and a bright red light enveloped the entire room and everything around them. Kai Zioan began to shout the woman's name as the glass in the office began to burst. Yun Jen turned around when he heard the noise. His eyes flashed with red light. He stood in the middle of the empty corridor and turned around to look toward the other end. A diagram of the building began to form in his mind. Yun Jen tried to figure out what exactly was the matter. All around the building, he could hear the voices of students talking about what looked like a window had broken in the principal's office. Someone was asking about whether everyone had heard that bully Shihyui had died. Another voice talked about how someone saw Gulia, who was in this class, being called to the principal's office. Someone else said that if he remembered correctly, Shihyui was bullying her. Someone replied and said that did the information about the girl from the afterlife on the forum turn out to be true. Yun Jen covered his eyes. Gulia. The name is displayed on the first page in the legend of the girl from the afterlife. She is the first person to contact her. In the book, a page was opened with the inscription and information. Gulia, a student of Jiang City High School, went to the Kingdom of the Dead website, wrote the name of her classmate Shihyui in the chat room, and then met the girl from the afterlife. Shihyui died. During the time Gulia hesitated, the number of people who contracted with the girl from the afterlife had increased dramatically. To prevent harming the innocent, Yun Jen set up many psychological obstacles. Only being in despair would people be able to write a message. But in just a few days, more than 100 bully disciples had died in Jiang City, and he wasn't too surprised about it. The information that came up was good and evil points, +1, legend points, +150. Even though there were more revenge incidents with the girl from the afterlife than looking through the slot, there still weren't many points. 2 situations with domestic violence and public bullying were on the scale. In other words, the bullying cases were not as bad as domestic violence, which was why not as many points were given. However, Yun Jen still did not have to worry about life expectancy. He opened one of the pages of the book and saw the information: City Legend Records, Legend Points, 23,000, Good and Evil Points, 300, Spiritual Power, +0, Remaining Lifespan, 99 days. So, last night, Yun Jen tried to add something to the spiritual power. A dark light enveloped Yun Jen. Black lines began to form in the air around him. He looked at his hands and wondered. There seemed to be no change. What popped up above his head was that spiritual power had added +1, good and evil points had dropped by -1. He decided to add more. Yun Jen patted his finger on the open page on the spiritual strength line. Yun Jen's eyes widened, a bright light shone in them. His spiritual strength increased by several times, +1 as his good and evil points began to drop in the same score by -1. In total, Yun Jen ended up with a total of 9 points of spiritual power. Yun Jen stretched out his hand in front of him. His eyes lit up with a bright red light as his outstretched hand began to turn the pages of a book. A dark light enveloped him. Suddenly, he realized that he had reached his limit and lost his composure. Yun Jen jumped off the stairs and raced down the floor. He flew through the air and realized that after waking up today, Yun Jen noticed that his hearing and vision skills had improved greatly, plus he had become much more enduring. Yun Jen landed on the ground as he flew down the stairs. He picked up the crystal that was hanging around his neck, looked at it and smiled. It seemed that if he continued to write, he would become truly special. Yun Jen heard a dialogue nearby. 3 girls were standing in the center, and a woman was talking about how the curse was very strong, because it was connected to the soul, but fortunately, the others were not affected. The department's lulies would soon come and take away Gulia. Yun Jen frowned and squinted his eyes, looking in their direction. A scheme immediately formed in his head as he listened to their conversation from a distance. The girl asked what they would do with her, and the principal replied that to observe. King Jai added that in the report, however, she would say that she was just acting in self-defense. Gulia immediately burst into tears and wiped the tears that were streaming from her eyes and thanked her while the other girl looked admiringly at Mrs. King Jai. All 3 of them walked out of the building and King Jai beckoned the girl to follow her. The assistant said goodbye to Gulia with a smile on her face as she waved goodbye, and Gulia saw them off and bowed deeply. The sun had already started to slowly set. Suddenly, King Jai stopped and looked back, as if to look directly at Yun Jen. His eyes immediately widened in surprise. The assistant came closer and asked what was the matter while Gulia looked questioningly at the both of them, standing a short distance away. King Jai frowned and covered one eye, saying that she felt as if someone was watching them. Yun Jen stood behind the building and hid, thinking about the fact that she could see curses, and did she also possess the ability. The girl called out to King Jai again while the girl looked around and thought about whether he had ended up leaving. Yun Jen continued to hide behind the building, hiding behind the wall and thinking about who was this even, was she really from public security? Yun Jen frowned slightly, a drop of sweat rolled down his face. It looked like they had come to deal with the case of the girl from the afterlife. King Jai stood still, frowning heavily. Yun Jen realized that she had come. Slowly, the woman started walking towards where the guy was standing and hid behind the wall. Yun Jen frowned and thought about the fact that she couldn't be allowed to find the notebook, because if she saw this, there was no telling what would happen. The footsteps of heels started to sound closer and closer. Yunjin looked back in horror. His eyes widened when a voice said that they had finally found him. A young man walked up to Yunjin and wrapped his arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Yunjin frowned slightly, looking towards the guy. He grudgingly asked why they were here. The two guys he knew formalized a male grip on him in a combined technique, wrapping their arms around him from different sides. One of them grudgingly said that they were finally able to catch him, while the other talked about how he had immediately escaped as soon as class was over. They held him in their grip and talked about them all going to the club together. Yunjin smiled and spread his hands apart, talking about letting go first and then they could already go normally, to which the two guys immediately told him in one voice that no. Yunjin sighed and with an awkward smile, spread his hands apart, saying so be it. King Jai stood nearby and thought about how she had apparently just made up too much for herself. The ringing of the phone interrupted her thoughts and she picked up the phone, answering the call. The voice on the phone said who it was and King Jai turned around, saying that she was on her way. King Jai walked back towards the stairs, the final room of the Ghost Society. The two guys continued to hold Yunjin from both sides while talking about how maybe they would let him go at least for now, and were they really so afraid that he would still eventually escape. One of them grudgingly said exactly that, and the other confirmed and said that the minimum number of club members was 3, and if the teacher found out that he was going there alone, their club might be abolished. Yunjin smiled awkwardly and his face turned pale when he said that he had just been very busy the past few days. One of the boys asked what kind of things he could be doing besides sleeping and for him to stop lying already, and Yunjin replied that he was just writing a story. The other asked what kind of stories he was writing and what genre exactly. Yunjin nodded and said that he was, and they were stories about the supernatural. They immediately ran up to him and demanded to see what kind of stories they were, and Yunjin smiled awkwardly, saying that he only had drafts so far. They both immediately pulled away from him unhappily and said that he was already boring and didn't trust them at all, and the other one confirmed and said that they were being nice to him. Yunjin laughed awkwardly and told the guys to at least wait a little while for him to finish first. Yunjin thought about his book and wondered if he should really show them, smiling awkwardly and scratching the back of his head. The guys sat down by the computer and asked if Yunjin had no inspiration, and one of them said with a satisfied smile on his face that he had a whole bunch of similar ideas lately, and maybe he would be able to inspire Yunjin a little. When Yunjin was about to ask why not show him then, the boy interrupted him and started to tell him about an urban legend that had recently appeared on Forum R, and it was called The Girl from the Afterlife. The boys quickly turned on the screen, which displayed the words Forum R Girl from the Afterlife, loading. Yunjin immediately froze with a stone face. He thought to himself that they were actually trying to inspire him with his own story. It's not going to be easy. Suddenly, one of the boys interrupted his musings and said how was this possible? The internet had stopped working. The computer screen displayed 404 not found, Forum R server not found. Yunjin opened his eyes in surprise and asked that maybe it was an internet problem. However, they said no and pointed to the fact that pop-ups still kept appearing. Yunjin hesitated, rubbing his chin, and walked closer to the screen. The other guy picked up his phone and said that on the phone, the Wi-Fi was working and the videos were also turning on. He tried to open the forum on his phone and stretched his hand with the phone forward, showing the error on the screen and saying that he couldn't even access the forum from his phone. Yunjin frowned slightly and thought about the fact that the problem was not with the network and the forum was just blocked. Yunjin pondered and thought about whether or not the hell communication could have been blocked, and maybe it was King Jai's doing. Yunjin immediately rushed out of the office while the two boys shouted at his back about what was the matter and whether he was abandoning them again, and Yunjin shouted out that he urgently needed to go. Yunjin was rushing down the corridor of the school. A couple of girls and boys were walking ahead of him. The guy who was walking beside him was immediately stopped with a fist, hitting him in the face. Yunjin stopped as the young man fell to the ground and the things he was carrying in his hands scattered in different directions. The bully indignantly stood beside him and talked about how he was death-seeking and let him just try to complain to the teacher. The bully noticed Yunjin, who was silently standing to the side. He immediately rolled up his sleeves after recognizing Yunjin's familiar face. The young man who had been hit and knocked to the ground started shaking and crying. He reached out his hand to Yunjin and asked him to help him, but he rushed past him and replied that he didn't have time for that right now. The young man looked back in horror at the receding figure of Yunjin with his eyes wide open as tears flowed from his eyes. He was immediately interrupted by a mocking voice that asked what was the matter and immediately kicked him in the back. The bully asked him, did he really think about the fact that Yunjin would cover for him every time all the time? The bully continued to kick him in the back with his foot, stepping on him and shouting that everyone knew that Yunjin was a mood man, and if he was in that mood, he would probably help him again somehow. The young man clenched his hand into a fist, his broken glasses lying on the ground beside him. The reflection of a face distorted in anger was reflected in one of the lenses of the glasses, when the other had a figure receding into the distance. Jen ran out of the building and leaned on his knees, trying to catch his breath. He thought about whether they could have already gotten far enough away. Jen breathed heavily from running and looked in front of him. He opened his eyes and the voices of dialogue began to reach him again. He could hear people talking amongst themselves and someone complaining about how much homework was assigned today, or how their exam went, and someone responding that they were only 2 points short. Jen frowned and realized that he couldn't see anything. If also the infernal communication was disabled, then it meant that they were already a serious personal threat to him. Jen clenched his jaws and touched the crystal that was hanging around his neck. He thought about the fact that he had to find out their identities urgently, or else he would be completely bound hand and foot. Jen clutched the crystal around his neck and frowned, thinking that if he didn't increase his lifespan, he would die. A huge beast with a giant eye in the center was smiling, and on the eye itself was a character. Jiang City, Public Security. In the office room, there were many people sitting at computers. 2 girls were standing nearby, and a third girl with long dark hair said that it was just as King Jai had said, to prevent more victims. They had blocked forum. Our King Jai turned around and nodded, saying that it was a great job, and what about the hellish communication? The girl clutched the documents to her chest and smiled awkwardly, saying that it couldn't be disabled. King Jai rubbed her chin thoughtfully and said that it seemed the website was under protection. She turned around and waved her hand, telling them to clear the room and have everyone leave the building. The girl stood behind her with a startled smile and wanted to say something, but King Jai went to the window and said while looking out the window at the city that she would try to block the website at midnight tonight. An assistant stood on the other side of her and watched her admiringly while another girl with long dark hair stood with her mouth open in surprise. The people in the office meanwhile began to take things out, talking amongst themselves and talking about where she had even come from, and another was told that it was an order from the head of the special department. The girl at the entrance was waving sheets with her hand held up and talking about getting them all out of the building and packing up their belongings. Someone indignantly said that they had more work to do, but everyone slowly packed their belongings into a box and headed for the exit. The girl with dark hair was talking about the suicide series being turned over to the Special Division. Someone asked her what the Special Division was, and she explained that the Special Division reported to the Department of Public Security's top think tank, specializing in all sorts of strange occurrences that regular departments couldn't do anything about. She added that in short and in general, it was an order from the top. Night, 23:55. King Jai sat at her computer, staring at the red computer screen. The assistant stood next to her desk and asked Mrs. King Jai that it was just a website blocking, and was it really that serious? King Jai answered with a question to a question and asked how many days of training she had. The girl smiled awkwardly while scratching her cheek and replied that it was only 3 days. King Jai meanwhile looked at the red computer screen and continued to type something quickly on the keyboard. She replied that it was coming out that some newcomer had been sent to her. The assistant smiled awkwardly and blushed, but didn't say anything. The time was already 23:56. The assistant bowed deeply and apologized loudly to Madam King Jai, saying that she wasn't going to hide that she was a new recruit and thought that she already knew everything. However, the woman brushed it off and said just forget it, and as she thought, the experienced assistants in the special department had long since died out. She added and asked if she had taken courses on other signs and all. The aide looked up and replied with a satisfied smile that of course she had. She said that ghosts were the souls of people who had died either from old age or for some other reason. They were basically no danger. The assistant frowned seriously and continued on, saying that as a rule they stopped them immediately. There are other ghosts who had a strong grudge or anger when they were alive. Upon encountering such a ghost, it should be eliminated immediately. However, if your strength wasn't enough, you should have fled as far away as possible. As for the others, ordinary people did not notice them. Images of various monsters opening their mouths appeared in his mind. The assistant immediately smiled and winked, saying that no matter what, she believed that King Jai would be able to eliminate everything. King Jai smiled and quietly chuckled, replying that since that was the case, then she would tell her a fact. She put her hand forward and a red circle formed in her hand. To humans, otherness was not only something unfathomable, but also something immortal. Only another could handle and kill another other. King Jai smiled and asked what about humans. They could only note the strange circumstances of people dying. She added that it was necessary to keep a distance from the otherkin but find a way to prevent further killings. King Jai continued and asked if the assistant knew why the special department had sent her even though she had only been training for 3 days. Because investigating strange incidents on her own, there was a high chance that she would die soon and the assistants were expendable. The assistant flinched when she heard her words. Images of deaths, corpses of other assistants immediately appeared in her mind, and she immediately trembled, not believing her ears. King Jai had said that she was supposed to check the girl for curses in the morning at school, but she was too inexperienced to do so, so she didn't notice anything. The time had already reached. The computer screen was burning red when a sign appeared on the screen with a clarification. "Are you sure you want to run the program?" King Jai rose from her chair and pointed her hand at the screen, telling her assistant to unleash her spiritual power and press enter. The girl immediately flinched as she stared at the screen. King Jai smiled and bowed her head, telling her not to worry, because if she died, her family would receive a pension of 5 million. The aide trembled as she moved closer to the desk. She clutched the documents to her chest as she reached out a trembling hand to the keyboard. King Jai corrected the glasses on her face and said that of course she could refuse, leave the room and leave the special department. The assistant continued to tremble as her hand slowly reached down to the button and she pressed it with a loud cry. A yellow light formed at the point where it was touched. King Jai opened her eyes in surprise as a strong shockwave shattered the immediate surroundings. The assistant fell to the ground, and King Jai put up a protective field, shielding herself and the girl on the ground. When the dust cleared, King Jai looked at the screen burning with red light. The assistant called out to her and clarified if everything was of course. She raised herself slightly, rubbing her bruised head. King Jai moved closer and saw the errors on the screen and the damaged computer with the same open tab. King Jai looked at the screen carefully and said that it looked like it wasn't actually as bad as she had originally thought. The assistant looked in the same direction and her eyes widened in surprise. On the screen, burning red light burned the inscription "Infernal Communication," and the face of a girl with dark abysses instead of eyes looked at them. The assistant immediately snuggled up to King Jai and cried out loudly, grabbing her hand. King Jai looked at the screen with a serious face, frowning slightly. The assistant shouted and asked what it was. The smoke and dust cleared, revealing a computer screen. The ghost's face continued to stare at them from the screen. Its dark, empty eye sockets stared back at them. King Jai frowned and said that the infernal communication was disabled, and maybe it was some sort of warning of some sort. King Jai stepped away from the table as the girl addressed her while standing behind her, and King Jai interrupted her and said that she had done well today and she wished her continued success. King Jai thought about the fact that if this was a warning, it meant that this was an unprecedented discovery since the special department was established. King Jai took out her phone and started dialing a number, bringing the phone to her ear with a serious face as she thought about that other, mind-controlling thing, and she hoped she was wrong. King Jai said to the man on the other end of the wire, addressing him as Hong Ying and saying that she needed him to help with the case of the girl from the afterlife. The man on the other end of the wire was holding the phone with his shoulder while he played a game when the girl added so what she needed him to do was to look at the picture of the eyeball, and he must have heard that over 200 people had died because of it. The man smiled and said that he knew that according to the information anyone who saw the pictures would die in agony. He clarified that she wanted him to look at them and laughed, saying that she wasn't going to die anyway. It was a special department with the code name Hong Ying. The man looked rather extravagant with bright pink hair, purple headphones on his shoulders, and a hoodie. He was holding a gamepad in his other hand while King Jai on the other end of the wire was talking about how he was an incredibly bad coworker, that you couldn't even ask him normally for help. Hong Ying said that they should make a deal, and it just so happened that there were two strange incidents happening at once, and he thought it would be better to investigate everything together. Hong Ying smiled while rubbing his nose and added that, so to speak, he would be her traveling companion on the road. King Jai smiled and replied that so be it, but he had to deal with the case of the girl from the afterlife first, and that she wasn't joking, for it was very serious. King Jai said one last thing, that the public security department was here and she should hang up as she pulled the phone away and pressed the reset button. The last thing he managed to say on the other end was a surprised shriek and words about them talking too much too fast. 10 minutes ago, 23:58. Yunjin sat at his desk, a book open with him lying beside him. He was typing on the keyboard and thinking about the fact that as soon as those two left the school, the forum was suddenly covered up at once. As he thought, it was all done to prevent the legend of the girl from the afterlife from spreading. Yunjin looked in front of him and thoughtfully rubbed his chin, frowning. He took the book in his hands and opened it, looking carefully at the contents. As for stopping the infernal conversion, he didn't even know if they would succeed. Yunjin believed that they belonged to some kind of organization investigating paranormal phenomena. It was rather unpleasant, because he hadn't thought that such organizations existed. Suddenly he was distracted and saw a notification sound, and his eyes frowned in surprise. A red sign popped up on his screen that read "Hell Communicating." The site wasn't blocked. He shifted his gaze to the book whose pages read, Kai Zioan from the Jiang City Special Department logged on Hell Communication, communication error. Yunjin slammed the book shut and clutched it to himself, exhaling in relief and saying what looked like he had been saved after all. Since they had failed to block the infernal communication, it only meant that their abilities were unable to curb the girl from the afterlife. However, how exactly were these two connected to the special division? Yunjin leaned back in his chair and then began to rapidly type on the keyboard with his fingers. Of course, there was no information about the special department in Jiang City on the internet. A notification popped up on the screen that said, "Sorry, no information was found for your query. Please try Wandu search engine." Yunjin frowned, his face slightly darkened. There was no information on the major forums and websites. In any case, taking them lightly was clearly not worth it either. Yunjin got up from under the table, the book flying beside the side of him. If he wanted to continue living, he couldn't let them trample the other he had created. Yunjin sighed, thinking about the fact that he just had to keep refining his spiritual power. He sat down on the bed, cross-legged, and the book hung in the air in front of him as dark red lights enveloped him. The last time he had reached the limit of his body, so he wasn't sure if he would succeed this time. Yunjin opened his eyes and put his hand out in front of him. The book immediately glowed with red light and the pages began to turn. He thought about the fact that suddenly he would no longer be able to keep everything under control. The page of the book had the following information: Urban Legends, Legend Points, 23,000, Good and Evil Points, 291, Spiritual Power, 9+, Remaining Lifespan, 90 days. Yunjin put out a finger and clicked on the Spiritual Strength line. Strength was the only guarantor of survival. Yunjin frowned, clenching his teeth as the dark energy rose into the air. The energy was too strong, causing the walls of the room to crack. Yunjin frowned, turning his gaze to his hand in surprise. A red flame had formed in his hand. His hand trembled as he realized that something had changed, and he thought it felt like it was swelling. He could feel the power filling him. He shifted his gaze to the book, and on the page was written, Spiritual Power +1, Good and Evil Points -100, your spiritual power has increased. Yunjin put his hand to his heart and told himself that no, and that it was his soul had grown. Yunjin stood up with the book in his other hand, kneading his neck. There were no side effects after the transformation. Even on the contrary, his body became more relaxed and all his senses sharpened. Yunjin's eyes flashed red as he shifted his gaze to the side. Red light shone from the cracks of the closed doors. He had a strange feeling as if someone was looking at him. Yunjin looked in front of him. A red glow enveloped the entire room. Yunjin chuckled and thought about the fact that he had actually felt someone's attentive gaze on him from time to time before. He walked closer to the door. Now that his spiritual power had grown, he could clearly sense where he was coming from. Yunjin put his hands on the door and pushed it open. He abruptly swung open the cabinet, looking down at the box labeled Fragile Items, Handle with Care. Yunjin smiled and thought to himself that he had all but forgotten about what was in here. He noticed a red light coming from the box. Yunjin took a closer look, then leaned towards the box and looked inside. The something inside immediately bounced away fearfully, and Yunjin smiled a radiant smile, questioning why he was so nervous. He pulled the box closer to him. He took the box in his hands and lifted it up, saying with a smile on his face that after all, he was the one who created this, so he shouldn't have been so worried. The something in the box immediately started trembling and resenting in an attempt to get out of his grip while Yunjin carried it with a satisfied face. He pulled the box out of the cabinet and placed it on the floor, slowly opening the box. Yunjin's face immediately distorted. With a swing, he jumped up and with a kick of his foot, sent the box with its contents flying. The creature in the box, which looked like an incomprehensible mass with a bunch of eyes, looked out of the box and called out for his mom. The room was plunged into darkness, and the space inside was illuminated only by the television, on which some children's show was on. The sounds of the television echoed throughout the dark room. The creature was peering out of the box curiously, grasping the edges of the box with its small hands so that there was only something that looked like a head with a huge eye and 3 small horns on its head. The creature made strange noises as it climbed out of the box and leaned against it, propping up its face like body part and waving its little tentacles cutely. It squinted its one eye slightly, making melodic sounds and looking at the red-cheeked creature in front of it. The creature smelled the odor and climbed out more boldly, climbing out of the box curiously. It shifted its gaze and saw Yunjin in front of it, who was standing with a smile on his face in front of him and holding a jar of something in one hand and food in the other. The creature immediately let out a sound of fear and horror at the sight of Yunjin's figure in front of it. The creature immediately quickly ran back into the box and hid when Yunjin sat down beside it on the sofa with food in his hands and said that it had been sitting in the box for so long and asked if it wanted to take a little walk. The creature didn't answer anything for a while, hiding in its box while Yunjin carefully waited for a reaction. The creature hesitantly peeked out of its box, still trembling with fear, its huge eye watering with fear as it hesitantly started to call out for its mother again. Yunjin smiled and sighed, frowning his eyebrows slightly. Although it looked quite scary, it was actually just an ordinary baby. Yunjin slightly pulled away from him and said that since that was the case, he would eat by himself then. Yunjin picked up the noodles he had brewed for the little guy and started eating himself with a satisfied flushed face. The creature immediately looked out of the box again with curiosity to see what was going on. Suddenly, the phone that was lying on the table in front of Jen started to ring and vibrate insistently. Jen grabbed the phone and leaned it against his shoulder as he continued to cool the noodles and eat them. The loud voice from the phone stunned Jen for a second, which demanded that he read the messages immediately. Jen smiled awkwardly, a little dumbfounded by such a loud voice on the other end of the wire that his head tilted slightly to the side. Jen listened to what was said next and his face became much more serious. The voice on the other end of the wire said that one anchor was broadcasting about killing a girl from the afterlife. Jen's face immediately tensed and frowned, and the creature meanwhile watched him curiously, peering out of the box. Jen asked again, and the voice on the wire said that it was the landlord who had previously opened a discussion about the girl from the afterlife on Forum R. The demonic chicken soup man. Today he wanted to meet the girl from the afterlife live. The camera flashed in the dark light, showing about the live broadcast. A young man with a frantic face leaned in front of the camera that was broadcasting live. His eyes were open and bloodshot. He was smiling and asking the people on the airwaves if they should wait a few more minutes, and that he really wanted the girl from the afterlife to take them away soon. Several people wrote comments on the airwaves saying things like, "Leftover love, actor. Well, we'll see. Want to go to heaven? Isn't this a montage? Will it all happen live? Electric Blade, tears, proud of the host, internet friend, why is the screen black, where's the picture? Frozen chicken, am I the only one scared? Don't believe in love, let's face the fear, melon lover, cool." The presenter stepped slightly away from the camera. He continued to shake and smile madly, his eyes wide open. Behind him, a monitor screen was visible, showing a red light illuminating the room. The host said that of course he knew they were in a hurry, but they shouldn't have worried because the real show was about to begin. The host chuckled madly as the comments on the airwaves continued, "Hurry up and get started. Good luck, host, hope to see you again tomorrow. Please leave a comment. Go ahead, strongman, hurry up, can't wait any longer." The host continued to laugh madly as he left his phone with the broadcast nearby and sat down at his computer, turning around to face his viewers. He smiled with a crazy look and said that many people said that after entering their name into the hell chat room, the girl from the afterlife never appeared, and maybe she didn't really exist at all. Jen sat at his computer and carefully watched the madman's ether. He leaned his head on his arm, silently watching the happenings on the screen. The madman meanwhile began to act even crazier, saying that this was utter nonsense as his hands quickly began typing on the keyboard while his mouth was wide open along with his eyes. He jumped up from his seat, dark shadows of madness walked across his room, plunging the room into a red glow. He threw his hands up and spread them apart, saying that if they wanted the girl from the afterlife to appear, their heart must be filled with resentment, you must be cornered. The anchorman crouched down and started giggling madly again. He walked over to the phone that was airing and added that such was the rule of the girl from the afterlife. His eyes burned with madness, his mouth was ajar and steam was coming out of it. The comments on the airwaves kept coming, and people wrote, "Anchor, you stink, you're so terrifying, nightmare." Jen smirked, leaning on his arm and squinted slightly. Jen thought to himself, did the presenter really think that he had figured out the rules of summoning a girl from the afterlife? Because it wasn't that simple really. Jen held the mouse in his other hand as he continued to watch the stream with interest. He thought to himself that they would still see if he could actually summon her. It was already night, the time was 30. Community of happiness. It was already night outside, lanterns illuminated the dark streets and buildings. King Jai was standing with a young man with red hair. They leaned on the curb, illuminated by the night lantern. They were listening to a live broadcast on the phone, from which the anchor's voice was blaring out, talking about how he was just brimming with resentment. King Jai held an earpiece near her ear while she held the phone in her other hand. With a serious face, she was giving out information through the earpiece, talking about the happiness community, 4th floor, 4th block, room 404, for them to prepare to interrupt the live broadcast and arrest him. The man sat next to him and held his cell phone in his hand, looking at the screen. He had a can of drink in his other hand, and he turned to King Jai with a smile on his face. He squinted his eyes slightly and asked how she thought he was really telling the truth. King Jai replied that it was quite possible. 2 days ago, the special department had discovered some criminal experimenters, but they hadn't contacted the girl from the afterlife, and that also struck her as strange. King Jai covered her eyes and said with a serious face that it was clear now and she was thinking that those criminals' offense wasn't strong enough. She turned to the man and added that perhaps that person had prepared in advance. The man smiled and looked at her questioningly. They both turned toward the building, looking at the window burning with red light. King Jai tucked her hands into her pockets and said that although people didn't possess spiritual power, but one couldn't underestimate them. After all, people who could figure out the rules and survive. Stronger than some mentors with spiritual power. Jen sat with his arms crossed between him with burning, bright eyes. The host continued to broadcast with a crazy face, saying that how he thought there were still people who didn't believe, so he was inviting everyone to see it with their own eyes. The host sat at his computer, pointing at the keyboard with his hand while the other held the live streaming phone. He was smiling madly and people kept writing new comments. Group of actors, come on, keep your show going. Cutie, host, all you do is scare. Melon Lord, looks like the host is up to something. Maybe he'll make it work. Melon Hillbilly, I used to try to put my father's name in as an experiment too. Impersonator, go ahead. Crumbs, tried to put a name in too and it didn't work. Geez, law firm director, good luck. Anchor, we're rooting for you. Breaking Wind, afraid he's going to die. The presenter held the phone in his hands with his mouth and eyes crazily open, talking about what they could try now. He stretched his hand out to the keyboard and pressed a button. A screen popped up on the computer screen saying how I can help you. The broadcast immediately sprinkled comments from various people saying, cool, what's going on? Cheating? That's not true. Cool. This is very entertaining. You're awesome, awesome, cool, success. Host, you're worthy of your nickname. Hurry up, write a name. The presenter opened his eyes as he continued to smile madly and talk about how he had finally really succeeded. Suddenly, he fell silent for a couple seconds. His hands began to shake and he placed the phone on a special stick, leaving it standing to the side. The presenter smiled madly, sweat began to trickle down his face. He looked away and said that this way they wouldn't be able to see anything here. He smiled nervously, his hands continued to shake. He also added that they should wait just a little longer and it wouldn't be long before they would see the girl from the afterlife. Placing the phone down, he turned around abruptly and looked at the red screen behind him. His gaze was frightened. He immediately shuddered and pressed his lips together nervously, looking over his shoulder. Leaving the phone where he intended it to be, he straightened up and looked at the computer screen, turning to face it. He continued to shiver, slowly walking closer and closer, shuffling his feet on the floor. His eyes widened and sweat continued to run down his face. As soon as he came closer and put his hands on the keyboard, his hands immediately started shaking madly again and his breathing quickened. He slowly began typing a name as he continued to shake and talk about what they were about to witness. He clamped his eyes shut sharply as he opened his mouth, drool flying from his mouth and shouting loudly that now they were about to witness a true miracle. He moved the cursor and clicked on the message. Suddenly a notification popped up on his phone screen that the live broadcast had been completed. Live broadcast time, 4 hours, 44 minutes and 44 seconds. Data, total views, 31,451. Highest online, 59,269. Reactions, 29,000. New subscribers, 65,801 people. Gifts, 0. Sent red envelopes, 0. Rank among the live broadcast of Jiang City, 1. The broadcast immediately sprinkled a lot of anxious comments. Ended. Cut off. Is this the end? Why is there nothing? Why so abruptly? What about the girl from the afterlife? Horror. We were expecting a lot of similar other comments. Is this the work of the girl from the afterlife? Yuan curiously continued to sit at the table and stare at the computer screen as he opened the book. He wanted to see the further development, but he noticed that the broadcast had suddenly interrupted. Yuan opened the book, a red light filled the room. Suddenly, Yuan heard some voice behind him. The room was dark, and only the red light illuminated the room. Yuan didn't even turn around to ask if it was the kid as he continued to hold the book in his hands and scrutinize the contents of the pages. Suddenly, a landscape was drawn on his computer screen, with a bright sun in the center, illuminating the red sky. The girl's legs dangled from the ceiling while Yuan continued to sit and stare into his book in front of the red computer screen. The dark, black shadow of the girl appeared behind Yuan back. Her eyes burned with red light as her long hair surged upwards. Yuan eyes flashed with red light. He turned around abruptly and saw the girl in front of him hanging in the air above him. She was looking at him with bright burning eyes. Yuan frowned when he saw her. The girl floated closer to him, her face expressing nothing. She opened her red eyes and stared at the young man, her face grim. She extended her hand towards Yuan, and the latter's face contorted in surprise. It was a girl from the afterlife. However, why did she suddenly appear at his place? The utility room. A bright eye peered through the crack of a locked door. A trembling boy with glasses peeked out of the door and kept crying, begging to be allowed out. A huge lock was hanging on the door, blocking all way out. He heard a noise in the way the phone with the picture of the boy and his family on the wallpaper fell to the floor. He immediately turned around sharply. A trembling hand reached for the phone on the floor. The boy began to scream and cry loudly, pulling out the phone and screaming that if the girl from the afterlife was real, then he wanted her to take them all away so they would all die. Suddenly, he interrupted and looked in front of him. The boy was grabbed and thrown to the floor, blood dripping from his mouth. The man holding him said that he had heard that the legend of the girl from the afterlife was quite popular lately, and had he really decided to write his name. The boy saw the mad face of a man who was swinging to strike. The blow immediately struck him in the face, shattering his teeth and face. Jen started throwing one punch after another at him, who was screaming about how he had already told him that if he suddenly dared to do that, he would definitely send him to the other world. The boy continued to yell about how he didn't do it and only wanted to know if the legend was true. Jen smiled madly and replied that not even Yu and Jen had helped him, and did he really think anyone else would help? And surely he must hate Yu and Jen. The boy madly shouted with tears in his eyes that of course he hated it. He grabbed the phone in his hands and started typing the name. A girl was hovering above Yu and Jen. He watched her carefully and thought to himself, could what he had created really kill him? Yu and Jen frowned and wondered if she had come to take him to the afterlife. The girl silently looked at him, then said that no, even though his name was mentioned, she could not take him away as Yu and Jen was outside the rules. The contract was signed and only he could decide the outcome. He could cancel the contract and send the person who wrote his name in the chat room to hell. Yu and Jen exhaled calmly and asked who wrote his name, and the girl replied that it was Kin Zayashin. Yu and Jen turned away and tried to remember who it was. What he tried to remember was, did he even know him? If he terminated the contract, he would realize that Yu and Jen had not entered the afterlife and would be sixed on by the people from the special department. Yu and Jen turned around and frowned, talking about her taking him to the afterlife. However, he wanted to meet him first. The girl held the flower in her hands and said that she understood everything. Kin Zayashin opened his eyes and woke up abruptly, finding himself in an unfamiliar place. He was lying on the grass in the middle of a field when he came to his senses. He saw a girl from the afterlife in front of him who was holding a lantern and looking at him. He backed up and started talking about how everything was wrong and that she was supposed to take Yu and Jen away, and how did he end up here. Suddenly, a mask of a monster with burning eyes appeared in front of his face and asked if he was Kin Zayashin. It asked him what he had entered the name Yu and Jen for. The young man immediately frightenedly recoiled from the dark figure and asked why they were asking that and that he wasn't ready to die yet. The figure started to stagger towards him while Kin Zayashin paced back and asked if Yu and Jen wanted revenge. Suddenly, a multitude of shadows rushed towards the young man, enveloping him from all sides, and he screamed loudly. He started calling for help and begged to be saved while the shadows continued to hold him. He turned to the girl and asked her to help him. The girl leaned over him and demanded an answer to his question. A shadow waved its hand in his direction and the young man was tossed into the air, causing him to scream loudly and say he would say anything. He began to shout and talk about how Yu and Jen had helped him once, and that if he had not passed by a second time, he would not have been beaten. Shadow fell silent and clarified, did that mean that he had taken offense at Yu and Jen? The young man hung head down in the air as the shadow said that he didn't know, but the girl from the afterlife had been created by him, and now he would have to answer for everything. The shadows began to encompass the young man as he tried to say something, and the shadow continued to say that instead of pointing his weapon at the true cause of his pain, he aimed it at everyone else, and the bully who hurt him would also answer for everything. However, he too would not escape punishment. The young man began to scream and say what he realized was his mistake. His body was dragged by the shadows, sinking to the bottom of the dark ocean. Suddenly, he opened his eyes and found himself in his room, the house of the demonic chicken soup man. King Jai sat next to her colleague while the host lay on the floor tied up. King Jai held a flower and asked him to use his spiritual power. The man put his hand out over the flower and his hand burned, after which he started blowing on his palm. King Jai said that only the recipient could rip off the color and maybe they should have made a plan. He asked why she couldn't use her power and the girl replied that she had tried, however her glasses showed that she would die if she did anything unnecessary. The man immediately asked in surprise that she was going to force him into this as well, and she replied that there was no plan yet, so he could leave if he wanted. The man remained silent, but then immediately laughed and said that she didn't get the joke at all. They both headed for the exit, grabbing the lead man by the leg and dragging him along the floor with them. Then there's no time to waste, let's take him to the special department, Hong Ying said with a smile on his face. But there was anxiety in his eyes. King Jai's words had scared him.